Over the past week or so, we've been looking at Chapter 9, World War II. Today we're going to look at the last section, Section 6, World War II at home. While the American soldiers have been fighting in Europe and in the Pacific Ocean, we're now going to look at how Americans dealt with the war at home. During World War II, America mobilized for war. Unlike any other war in U.S. history, Americans were totally involved in the war. The wartime economy brought an end to the Great Depression. Suddenly, there were jobs for everyone. American industry switched to war production, building war materials, tanks, planes, guns, helmets, bullets, belt buckles. But the same factories that used to build cars and appliances that were now making guns and planes could no longer make those appliances, so you could not get a new car or a new washing machine. Now, before Pearl Harbor, American military was very small, about the size of the Romanian military. But during the war, over 16 million served, about 11% of the population, and over 400,000 died during the war. Later, these people would be referred to as the greatest generation. Americans joined the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army Air Force. Even women joined the military. Here's a photograph of my Uncle John on the right. He joined the United States Navy at the age of 21. Yet despite the great sacrifice the greatest generation made, there was no national memorial to them. Finally, in 2004, the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. opened. It's on the Mall between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. Now, the culture in America from 1941 to 45. Of course, movies were still very popular. They've been popular since the Great Depression. We still had escapist movies, to help Americans forget the war. Movies like Citizen Kane and The Maltese Falcon. There were patriotic movies to inspire Americans like Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart. Comedies that spoofed the Nazis. Here we see Charlie Chaplin in his famous movie, The Great Dictator. Even Disney produced movies as propaganda. Here we see Mickey and Minnie with their ration books. We'll talk about them later. And we have Donald Duck reading Mein Kampf. And this was a movie that was put out by Disney showing the life of a small boy growing up in Nazi Germany. Now, music, of course, was still very, very popular. Not only did it entertain people at home, but it also entertained the troops overseas. Big band music, which became popular in the 1930s, continued to be the very popular music of the 1940s, led by the famous conductors like Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Tommy Dorsey. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree was one of the most popular songs with soldiers. It was first introduced by Glenn Miller and later popularized by the Andrews Sisters. Vera Lynn's White Cliffs of Dover, and of course the Andrews Sisters' Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy were some of the more popular songs of the 1940 war years. Sports changed like never before. Athletes from the major sports enlisted in the military. Ted Williams, the top home run hitter for the Boston Red Sox, became a U.S. Marine pilot. There he is, second from the left. With a lot of the baseball players overseas, we see the creation of the All-American Girls Baseball League, popularized by the Tom Hanks movie A League of Their Own. Players who could not serve in the military, they're either too old, too young, or in one case, missing an arm. Here we see St. Louis Browns outfielder Pete Gray, who lost an arm in a childhood accident playing Major League Baseball. Movie stars also enlisted in the military. Some entertained the troops. Here we see Bob Hope. Some fought in combat. Here we have Clark Gable from Gone with the Wind. And Jimmy Stewart from It's a Wonderful Life. Became a bomber pilot and flew missions over Germany. And we have Henry Fonda from The Grapes of Wrath. He joined the United States Navy. Now, rationing is going to become very important in America. There were many shortages because of the war. There were things that were needed for the military, or supplies were just being cut off because other countries had been taken over by the enemy. We used to get a lot of our sugar from the Philippines. Obviously, that stopped when the Japanese captured the islands. Now, because of these shortages, the government instituted a system of rationing. Things like sugar, coffee, meat, and butter. Every family would get a ration coupon book. You have all these little tickets you could pull off. They all had points. You still had to pay for it, but you also need to have a coupon so that you could actually get whatever one of these items you needed. Everything was clothing was rationed, as was gasoline. Americans hated gas rationing. Most families got a sticker to put in their window with the letter A in it. You can see it here in this car in the windshield on the left-hand side. And that A sticker would give you only 4 gallons a week, which if you usually got 20 miles to the gallon, that gave you 80 miles you could drive every week. Other people like doctors and people who had important jobs had different stickers, but the average family got a letter A. Also, chrome was in high demand by the military. A lot of cars, you can see the car in the background, had these big chrome bumpers, but people donated them to the military and replaced them with these wooden bumpers, as you see here, and this lady's pointed to in front of her car. They also used a lot of gilt to keep you from driving. They put up posters like, showing an American tanker that had been torpedoed and sinking and saying, "Should brave men die so you could drive?" Using gilt to keep you off the roads. There was also drives to collect needed materials like scrap metal, rubber, paper, like we do in the school when we have toy drives and clothing drives. They did the same thing because all the stuff could be recycled into more materials. Victory gardens became very popular. People started to grow them in their front yards and their backyards. Growing vegetables that you couldn't get in the stores because of rationing, now you could have them. Now, war production. Every year, the U.S. raised its production goals and each year met them. Here we see a large plant on Long Island that produced bombers. Here they are producing B-24 bombers, the Liberator. The factory itself was almost a mile long. Here we see another factory building tanks, the Sherman tank on the right. By the middle of 1945, the end of the war, the U.S. had produced 300,000 airplanes, 100,000 tanks, 6 million rifles, and so on. Now, many men went off to war, so the women would take their place in the factories. Women worked in the defense industry, building planes and tanks. This is where we get the famous Rosie the Riveter. Now, financing the war was tough. Wars are expensive, so government spending went way up. Before the war started, the United States government had a budget of $8.9 billion, but by the end of World War II, it was $95 billion. Now, the government sold war bonds to finance the war. Everyone was encouraged to buy war bonds. They had war bond drives everywhere. You went to a movie, at the end they had a sign saying, "Buy a war bond." They would have people touring the country, war heroes, encourage everyone to buy war bonds. This, of course, will cause a huge national debt that would have to be paid for when the war was over. But here are some of my favorite posters. Don't let that shadow touch them. You see the swastika, and here's a little American children playing in the shadow coming down. Or buy before it's too late, before the German bombers are flying over American cities. Well, this is my personal favorite here. Here we have Uncle Sam leading the troops forward, saying buy war bonds, to encourage us all to get involved. Everyone came together to help win World War II. All Americans joined the common goal to come together to win. But there was some dark sides. One of them was the Japanese Americans. They suffered the worst discrimination of anyone during the war. American military leaders were worried that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast in California, Oregon, or Washington might be spies for Japan. So there was a lot of hostility towards Japanese because of Pearl Harbor. You see here, this was of a Japanese store owner trying to tell everyone that he was an American because people just weren't even buying from them. Now, in February of 1942, FDR signs an order removing all Japanese Americans. Now, these are U.S.-born Americans of Japanese descent, so they are U.S. citizens. But despite the fact they were citizens, they were going to be removed from the West Coast. They would gather up all their stuff and wait for buses and trains to take them to internment camps. About 110,000 people of Japanese heritage were. The trains would be met by soldiers who would guide them to where they would be living in these wooden barracks. They would eat in common areas. It was barbed wire. It wasn't electrified like, camps in Europe, but there were men with machine guns to make sure no one left. Many lost all of their possessions, their homes, cars, businesses. Now, up to 20,000 Japanese Americans fought in the U.S. military, and these were soldiers whose parents were being held in internment camps but still joined the military to fight. The United States didn't trust them to fight against other Japanese, so they were sent to Italy. Now, in 1988, Congress voted to pay $20,000 to each of the surviving Americans of Japanese descent who were interned during World War II. Now, another dark side was the American military. Now, since the Civil War, African Americans served in the military, but in segregated units. You might have seen the famous movie Glory with Denzel Washington talking about the story of the all-black 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Well, nothing had changed by the time we got to World War II. Now, during the Second World War, African Americans enlistment was at an all-time high with more than 1 million soldiers serving in the armed forces. However, the U.S. military was still heavily segregated. The U.S. Army allowed blacks to serve, but in segregated units. The United States Navy only allowed blacks to serve as waiters and busboys, what they called steward's mates on board naval ships. The U.S. Marines would not even allow blacks to enlist. But as the war progressed and the need for manpower grew, the U.S. military was forced to change. Now, during World War II, the U.S. Army used African Americans mostly as truck drivers. Now, before the war, in October of 1940, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. will become the first African American general in the United States Army, and he will push to integrate Army units. Famous general eventually got his own stamp. Now, the United States Army created segregated combat units, which they sent to Europe. One of them was the 761st Tank Battalion. This was the first black tank battalion. They fought in Europe. They were called the Black Panthers. They famously fought at the Battle of the Bulge. Jackie Robinson was actually a member, but the war ended before he was sent to Europe. The 96th Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers Division, was the only black infantry division to see combat in Europe. 2 of their soldiers would receive the Medal of Honor, but not until 1997. Here we see a picture of the members of the Buffalo Soldiers firing mortars against the Germans in Italy. The soldiers of the 92nd were featured in the 2008 Spike Lee film Miracle at St. Anna. Then there was the Tuskegee Airmen. These were the first African-American military pilots. The 332nd Fighter Group fought in North Africa and then later in Italy. They were led by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the general. They painted the tails of their P-51s red, so they got the nickname the Red Tails. They flew 1,578 combat missions and shot down over 100 German planes, including the first German jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262. The Tuskegee Airmen would be the subject of 2 major motion pictures. My favorite, 1995's HBO's Tuskegee Airmen, starring Lawrence Fishburne and Cuba Gooding Jr. Later in 2012, they made Red Tails. Cuba Gooding Jr. was back again. I didn't like this one as much. There was too much drama in this one. Davis will become the first African-American general in the United States Air Force in 1954. The Air Force, which was part of the Army during World War II, will split off and become their own branch of the military, and Davis will become the first African-American general in the Air Force. Now we're going to talk about the U.S. Navy. Here we have a picture of Doris Miller. He was born in Texas and joined the United States Navy before World War II started. He was a mess attendant, the only job that black men could have in the United States Navy, and he was stationed on board the battleship USS West Virginia. Now, the West Virginia was in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked. Now, Miller had no training whatsoever in using any of the weapons. But despite that, he voluntarily manned an anti-aircraft gun firing at Japanese planes. He was recognized for his heroics as one of the first U.S. heroes of World War II and was awarded the Navy Cross, that's the highest award the Navy can give, by Admiral Nimitz on board the USS Enterprise. That's the photograph you see here. He is the first African-American to be awarded the Navy Cross. Nimitz said of Miller, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such a high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Sadly, Miller died during the war when an aircraft carrier that he was stationed on board was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in the middle of the night, killing 2/3 of the crew. Earlier this year, the United States Navy announced it was naming its newest nuclear aircraft carrier the USS Doris Miller. Usually aircraft carriers are named after presidents or war heroes or great politicians, so this is actually a pretty amazing honor. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the Navy started to allow African Americans to serve in positions of authority. In 1944, the Navy commissioned 2 ships with predominantly black crews. That was also the same year the Golden 13. These became the Navy's first African-American naval officers. Later, another naval officer would rise to by the name of Samuel L. Gravely Jr., would become an officer, and after the war, he would become the first African-American ship captain. And in 1971, he becomes the first African-American Navy admiral. Now, the United States Marine Corps did not want black Marines, but Roosevelt pushed for it. So finally in June of 1942, the first group of black Marine recruits was admitted. Now, the blacks were formed into defensive units and sent to the Pacific. They became ammunition handlers in combat situations, mainly bringing up the ammunition that would be used for the big guns. Now, at the Battle of Saipan, they do very well. Here we see a photograph of some of the black soldiers at Saipan. Now, following the June 1944 Battle of Saipan, the very famous Marine Corps General Alexander Vandergrift said of the steadfast performance of the all-black 3rd Marine Ammunition Company, "The Negro Marines are no longer on trial. They are Marines, period." 125,000 African Americans served overseas during World War II. 708 were killed in action. However, no African American was awarded the Medal of Honor, our highest award, either during World War II or immediately afterwards. On January 13, 1997, more than 50 years after the end of the war, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 African American World War II veterans. The only living recipient was Vernon Baker of the 92nd Infantry Division. Baker was awarded the medal for his actions in 1945 while in combat in Italy. Baker died in 2010 at the age of 90. The last section we're going to talk about is politics during the 1940s. Now, FDR had won 2 terms during the Great Depression, but many were opposed to a 3rd term. It had been never done before. However, the fall of France in June of 1940 scared many Americans. Later that year would be the election of 1940. Now, Roosevelt knows many people, like the America First group, which my grandmother and grandfather were a part of, wanted to stay out of war, so he promised there would be no involvement in foreign wars if he was reelected. Many top Republicans, like Robert Taft or Thomas Dewey, were isolationists, so they weren't overly popular. So Republicans chose Wendell Willkie. He was a former corporate CEO who was for supporting Britain. But Willkie was hurt being a corporate businessman who many blamed for the Great Depression. So in the end, Roosevelt wins a 3rd term, 449 electoral votes to 82. Roosevelt carried 38 of the 48 states and 55% of the popular vote. These were good enough to win, but they weren't as decisive as his earlier elections in 1932 and 36. Now, FDR did have strong support from labor unions and urban political machines like the Hague machine in Jersey City. Blacks and traditionally Democratic South still supported him. Now, in 1944, Roosevelt was now the war president, and the war was going well. Paris had been liberated, and the Americans had just invaded the Philippines. Now, the Democrats did not like FDR's vice president, Harry Wallace. He was seen as too liberal and too pro-civil rights, so they actually dumped him from the ticket. This doesn't happen very often, but it did this time. Instead, the Democrats chose a Missouri senator named Harry Truman to be the new vice president. Now, the Republicans wanted General Douglas MacArthur to be their candidate, but he was fighting in the Pacific and couldn't campaign in the primaries. Wendell Willkie, who lost in 1940, didn't do well in the primaries, and he dropped out. And in fact, he died in October of 1944, right before the election. So the Republicans choose former New York Governor Thomas Dewey as their candidate. Roosevelt will defeat Thomas Dewey for a 4th term by a vote of 432 to 99. Roosevelt will carry 36 of the 48 states and 53% of the popular vote. His margins were the least decisive of the 4. Though New Jersey went for FDR in all 4 elections. Good for us. Now, Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. It was held in Yalta in the Crimea in Russia, and they were there to discuss the post-war plans for Europe. Germany was pretty much surrounded by the Russians, the British, and the Americans, who were closing in, and the war would only last for a few more months, so they were making plans what to do when the war would be over. Roosevelt, who was looking very tired and not very healthy, is seen here in the picture with Winston Churchill, who's on the left-hand side, and Joseph Stalin on the right-hand side. His health was definitely declining, and he looked thin and frail. So on March 29, 1945, Roosevelt went to the little White House at Warm Springs to rest. Sadly, on April 12th, he suffers a massive cerebral hemorrhage and dies. He was only 63 years old. He was loved by African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and Native. Here's his funeral procession in Washington, D.C. He was laid to rest on his estate at Hyde Park, New York. This is the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. that was built a number of years ago. They have a lot of waterfalls inside there. I thought it was pretty cool. This is me with my nephew Damien when we were there back, I think this was like 2001. Here's the famous statue of Roosevelt with his dog Fala. And of course the statue of him that was recently added of him in a wheelchair. So Vice President Harry Truman now is president. Harry Truman from Missouri is our 32nd president. He was born on May 8, 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, to the son of a farmer. Oh, isn't he cute? The S of Harry S. Truman did not stand for any one name. It was chosen as his middle initial to honor both of his grandfathers, Anderson Shipp Truman and Solomon Young. You can see those eyeglasses. Truman always suffered from bad eyesight. Truman graduated high school in 1901, but his family was too poor to send him to college. He's actually the last president not to have a college degree. Truman worked as a farmer. Truman tried to join the Army when World War I started, but his eyesight was so bad he was actually turned down. He was so determined to join, he actually memorized the eye chart, returned to apply again, and this time passed the medical exam. Truman was a captain in the 129th Field Artillery and fought in France during World War I. Here's an artist painting showing him fighting in combat against the Germans. Now, after the war, he married his longtime girlfriend, Bess Wallace, in 1919. They met in a Sunday school when he was only 6 years old. They opened a men's clothing store in Kansas City, but it went out of business. Now, Truman had a lot of bills, but he was determined and eventually paid every one of them off. The powerful Kansas City Pendergast political machine got Truman into politics. They got him elected to the U.S. Senate in 1934, where he got a reputation for honesty and courage. When the Pendergast political machine crumbled under federal investigations, Truman was investigated for potential corruption. They found none. Truman's famous line was, "Three things ruin a man: power, money, and women. I never wanted power, I never had any money, and the only woman in my life is back home right now." Truman was famous for his "the buck stops here" phrase, meaning he takes responsibility for everything. He even had made it into a sign for his desk at the White House. Well, that concludes our section on Americans in World War II. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're enjoying your day, and have a good Easter break. Thank you, and goodbye.